Good morning. Thank you. It's an absolute delight to be here today and start what promises to be a very interesting and an important session of the summit. And welcome Dr. Chintan Vaishnav, the Managing Director of Atal Innovation Mission, housed under the aegis of Niti Aayog. It's coming. So sorry about this, but actually the chief guest was here by 8:30 in the morning. We kept him away for some time because the crowd was not there in the hall. So he's just coming. He's just coming. So let him come and then we'll start the. So good morning once again. It is an absolute delight to be here today to start off what we call a most promising as well as very interesting and important session of the summit. And welcome Dr. Chintan Vaishnav, the Managing Director of Atal Innovation Mission, housed under the aegis of Niti Aayog. The history of India startups is not very old, but in a very short while, as all of us know by now, India has become the third largest startup ecosystem in the world with year-on-year growth of 12 to 15%. With a dominant young population in the country, the Indian youth have become job creators through founding startups. And it is believed that about 2 to 3 startups are born every day in our country. But the mortality rate are also really relatively high. As stakeholders, we should strive to give all the support to ensure the better longevity of the startups so that they flower into a matured corporation. Traditionally, Indian businesses environment has been dominated by strong family businesses, both at large and MSME levels. However, in the last decade, in particular, riding on the government's support, access to capital, innovation, entrepreneurship, and technology, we have been able to make a remarkable growth globally. In fact, the government support has been a vital pillar, and we are fortunate that one of the most important person leading the effort with us is there with us today. Dr. Chintan Vaishnav, who through Atal Innovation Mission and Startup India is making a big difference. A professor on leave from MIT US. He's a teacher, researcher, entrepreneur, and works in rural communities in India to find a solution for complex problems. Sir, it's a real honor and a privilege to have you with us today. And in short, Mr. Chintan Vaishnav is a man with a mission. We warmly welcome you, sir. Please, thank you.
Thank you very much for that warm introduction. Good morning, everybody. Very good. It's great to see you all. This year is a very unique year for India's innovation ecosystem also, because as India assumed the presidency of the G20, India proposed the creation of the Startup 20 engagement group, and then all the nations agreed to it, and so on. So we now, for the first time, have a Startup 20 engagement group as a part of the G20 architecture. And for the very first time, in some sense, this new form of business entity called startups have produced a communique for the world leaders. So an important moment in the policy evolution of the global startup movement. Let me say a couple of things about, let me say a bit about India's innovation ecosystem, which was talked about earlier. I realize that, with the G20, obviously, as you all know, the challenge is to talk about what is it that we can, or the opportunity is what is it that we can do as 20 that you can't do as one, right? Because each of us, what one realized in the creation of Startup 20 was that every country is putting in some level of emphasis behind startups. But all of it is, there's really no single sort of interwoven global startup ecosystem. And so that really is the G20 opportunity. What we know in the very first 6 months of having made this journey is that I think creation of Startup 20, I'll share some thoughts with you as a sort of the G20 architecture. Creation of Startup 20 made the G20 architecture what one would like to call ambidextrous, in that there was always the B20, the business 20, which cared about the large corporations. And then there was some or the other work for startups that happened as a part of B20. But B20 obviously could only, there was only little bandwidth that startups could get under the B20 umbrella because there was a lot to do. So creation of Startup 20 gives us now two platforms, one for the large entities and another for the smaller, more unique entities. This ambidexterity, and as we started to understand what this really means for the G20 architecture, we realized that in some ways we have solved large problems only through such ambidexterity. So while that kind of work goes on all the time, but in the COVID time it was very, very clear that you needed the small and the large. For instance, you needed BioNTech to innovate and come up with a vaccine. but you needed a Pfizer to scale the vaccine across the globe. You needed Oxford to come up with a vaccine, but you needed AstraZeneca to scale it across the globe. And this goes on in all industries, but it may go on at a much slower clock speed, and therefore we don't really see it come together in that way. But in the COVID time, when we had to do it to save the world, it was very obvious that we need this architecture. So we're at a very interestingly happy moment in that sense for G20 to have this architecture. Now, within that, the idea of Young Entrepreneurs Alliance is very, very resonant with the idea of startups, because if you look at India, for instance, the average age of a founder, there's not great, I have to say that the data is still somewhat anecdotal, but still is anywhere, average age is about 29 years. So that would speak to the youth, and there's very natural synergy between the Startup 20 and the YEA type of a group. So I'm really delighted to be here with all of you to be speaking to you. Let me say a bit about the India innovation ecosystem. So India's innovation ecosystem, we have had serious emphasis on India only in the last decade. See, Startup India was created in 2016. Atal Innovation Mission, which is the umbrella strategy body for the India innovation ecosystem. This is the body that I lead. That was created in 2016. When it was created, we had 100 startups in our country registered when it got created. There may have been more of such entities, but we didn't know, or we didn't really provide any safe harbor for them to keep regulation away from such entities. It was really only in 2016 that we started to think in that fashion. But today there are 100,000 startups. So very rapidly we have a very large number. People say that India's innovation ecosystem is the third largest ecosystem in the world. And we think that we are roughly 1/10 of the way in this journey. I say this because we have 100,000 startups. We have 1.4 billion people. That means we have one startup for 14,000 people. If you go to a startup nation like Israel, there's one startup for 1,400 citizens. If you go to many European active sort of startup ecosystems, etc., also about one startup in 2,000 to 3,000 people. Now, if you make an assumption that we have as much capability as any other nation, then we will grow 10 times, is one way to think about it. How long will it take to grow that much? Our doubling rate today is about 5 years. So it'll technically take about 15 to 20 years to get there. Is that long? It's not really long, actually. If you look at any very successful, vibrant startup ecosystem, it has taken 40 years for them to get there, right? So 20 years, not a long time. Can it happen sooner? It could happen sooner if with some non-linearities, because we still don't know. We still don't have an ecosystem which is at an inflection point, but once it reaches that inflection point, it could happen sooner. Can it happen slower? There are some things that could make it slower because there's great economic disparity. And so if that could have an influence on it, etc. But we are 1/10. We'll grow 10 times. So what is a part of this ecosystem? So I'll just give you very quick examples of what makes up India's innovation ecosystem. At the youngest age spectrum, we have what we call the tinkering labs or the maker spaces. So, for instance, our office has built 10,000 Atal tinkering labs, and these are maker spaces in schools. And there is never a dull moment in these places because all the kids, every morning I hear some or the other fantastic innovation by kids exploring things that we hadn't thought about and so on. So that's at the one end of the spectrum. We have some 700 plus incubators and accelerators across the country. Some of them, by the way, I was just looking at some of these startups that you see in the room next door are from these incubators. I was also noticing that there are very sector-specific endeavors that you will see in these exhibits here. And we have some very excellent sector-specific incubators. So we have incubators in defense, agri, health. Some are very eclectic. Like we have an incubator for coffee, which is a coffee supply chain incubator. So there are some 60 plus startups that are just about coffee, for example, and so on. So today our ecosystem stands at a point where you throw any question at it, and you will find some or the other startups trying something. So that's where we stand. One final thing that I should mention is that there are many challenges being run by many different people all across the country. I'd like to believe that in our sort of back of the envelope understanding, there's a hackathon a day type of vibrancy at this point in this ecosystem. There are some very serious challenges also. Many of you, if you traveled through Delhi airport, which I imagine you did, there's something called Digi Yatra, which lets you get through the airport in a touchless fashion. That's a challenge we ran, for instance, and we stitched the back end and the startups plugged in. So what undergirds this growth? One of the things that definitely undergirds this growth, other than, all of this infrastructure being built by the government, etc., is the digital public infrastructure, because the cost of acquiring a customer in India is very, very much lower than in many other places because of this pervasive infrastructure. Something to take a look at. Okay, the last thing I want to share with you is, what did we find in Startup 20 that matters here? So we found 5 things in Startup 20. We have called on the global leaders to raise the annual investment in the global startup ecosystem to $1 trillion annually. I'm delighted to share that Saudi Arabia is the first nation to commit to that direction. So that will be about 2.5 to 3 times the average money we have put into startups. Second, we have said that we need common global frameworks that we come up with, which we adopt. There are 2 frameworks that we have proposed. There's a third framework we have called for. The 2 that we proposed, first, this definition framework that everybody defines startups differently, all the different nations. That is because of their own regulatory legacy as to why they need to define this animal in the way they have defined it. And it's not reasonable to expect that everybody will come on use the same definition. But what we have proposed is a framework which rises a step above. And we have said that you have to really think about 5 components when you define a startup as a regulator. You have to think about what type of legal entity this is. What is the age of this entity? You may say, less than certain year, some number of years, etc. What is the size of this entity? These three things, the legal entity, the age, the size, that's the same as any small business. But the other two components, what is the scalability of this entity and what is the innovation in this entity? I think this is where the startups begin to differ. What is funny about this framework is that the acronym stands for LUSC, legal entity, age, size, scalability, and innovation. So there's one way to remember it. We have proposed a governance framework. So the second thing is the framework. The third is we have proposed ways for building these ecosystems to be more inclusive of any underrepresented group that matters to that region, and that and every region has their own groups that they consider underrepresented in this startup ecosystem. So that's the third piece. The fourth piece is, can we identify those startups that matter to the whole world, and do we have a mechanism to scale it? So that's and we have proposed a mechanism by which we can do this identification for the SDG focused startups. As what we found in our exercise, which was very fascinating, is that if you take any wicked challenge of this world and you break it down into pieces that you have to solve, and you look around the world, that is there a startup solving each of these pieces, you will find that any challenge you come up with, there are startups solving all pieces of that challenge. The question is, can we bring them together? So that is what that fourth piece is trying to do. And the final thing is, we have said that going forward, we will build a network of a global institution, which is a network of existing institutions across these countries, so that the agenda of this kind can be taken forward. So lots to come, a lot of excitement. We just had our summit on July 3rd and 4th, which brought together something like 850 or so people from 22 nations. Much excitement. Question is, how do we carry it forward with the same amount of gusto and excitement? But great, it's great to be here. It would be great to join hands and work together on something like this together. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I'm going to call upon my colleague Yashodra Bayorka to say thank you. She's also going to stick around to moderate the startup duel. A quick word about Yash as an introduction. She started her journey in private equity, as many entrepreneurs do, in kind of for-profit structured employment, but quickly found a calling in working in entrepreneurial with women's issues. She and her co-founder teamed up with the WEP to deliver compliance accounting information that supported 30,000 women entrepreneurs in their piece. So Yash, I'm going to turn the piece over to you to say a proper thank you to Dr. Chintan.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Chintan Vaishnav, Dr. Chintan Vaishnav, for speaking on the proposed engagement group for Startup 20. And I think that's, including that in the G20 architecture, as you mentioned, is a landmark milestone for the babies in the business. So thank you for kind of being the propeller and making sure that we could do that. And all the 5 pointers that you just illustrated, I think it aligns beautifully with the G20 YEA. And to take you on the offer of partnering even beyond the G20, as it culminates in September, we will be knocking on your doors and hoping to count on your support as we move on. The trajectory of growth of innovation from 100 to 100,000 startups that you mentioned in your speech, I think is reflective of the innovation landscape that the country has brought about. And I believe that there is a lot of more ground to cover, but I think we're on the right track. On that note, Dr. Vaishnav, thank you for your time. Thank you for visiting our InnoFest. I hope you liked more than what you just saw, so really appreciate that. May I invite our National Chairperson, Mr. Dilip Krishna, to please felicitate Dr. Vaishnav.